Hello again guys, and welcome back to another Big Al Devlin video here at the House of Devlin. Today we are, as you can see from the picture in front of you, very clearly speaking about, of course, the Flesh Eater Courts. And what we're going to be doing is starting a new series essentially where I will be sharing with you, video by video, in-depth look at the narrative behind the Flesh Eater Courts, because they have quite a significant and profound narrative for such a young army essentially. And what we're going to do today is focus upon literally the origin and the start of the Flesh Eater Courts as depicted in front of you. Ushrun himself, the very first aberrant vampire, otherwise known of course as the Carrion King. Now, the origin of the aberrants in general is basically a very ancient and tragic tale. It's ancient because it actually begins during the Age of Myth, which is the very start of the, essentially, like, well, the Age of Sigmar is its own age, but the very start of this new world that we now exist and play within. During the Age of Myth, the first aberrant roamed the realms. He had been once a favoured servant of Nagash, and back then, in his original form, he was both fair and strong, and was surrounded by a loyal court of knights and nobles. Wherever he travelled, he administered justice in the name of the great necromancer himself, and he built hallowed shrines dedicated to the worship of the god of death, and glorious mausoleums where departed ancestors could be given their due. He also helped the weak and the infirm pass into the underworlds, and took life from tyrants who misused their mortal existence. Before becoming the first aberrant, this champion was known by many names in many different lands. He was known as Sumeros, the Summer King, the Blood Rose Prince, and Ushrun the Handsome, to name but a few. He was both equally loved but also feared, and those civilizations that paid their due to Nagash welcomed his coming and lined their streets with grave rose petals as he walked amongst them, whereas those who had usurped the natural order of life and death were made to feel the full measure of his wrath. And so we see what would one day become the Carrion King originally was actually a very noble and very just and fair and handsome knight who led his forces with grace and true nobility. As was said, he was, yes, feared, but also loved by his people. Now, don't get me wrong, Ushrun was a vampire. He was not only a vampire, he was a vampire knight and a vampire champion of Nagash. That means that you don't want to get on his bad side, because within a moment's breath he would cut you literally in two without even thinking twice. He may have been noble, he may have been just, he may have been fair, but he was no idiot, and he would have been a true contender regards anyone who went up against him. He would have been incredibly powerful, and he would have rivaled the Mortarchs himself regards his physical capacity in close combat and magic and the use of magic. So this was no idiot, let's put it that way. But as far as vampires go, he was about as good as you get, because he was fair and he was just. He didn't pick and prey upon the weak or the bullied or anything along those lines. He simply, fed upon what he saw as tyrants and those who did not follow his king and his liege, which was of course Nagash, the king that he himself served. However, what is interesting is that as Ushrun travelled the lands, bringing to heel these tyrants and usurpers of that would stand against Nagash within the realm of Shyish, he actually did draw together around him a court of knights and nobles who were completely and absolutely loyal to Usran himself. They were drawn from different corners of the realm, and this court comprised themselves of the most, as I say, the finest and most noble of warrior lords, and together they rode resplendent as the glorious children of the night. Some of them were peerless statesmen, entrusted by their liege to impart chivalry to the kingdoms to which they travelled. Others were mighty warlords, commanded to defend the meek and eradicate the unjust. And these were the knights that would later, as we'll see, play such a pivotal role in supporting the Usran and essentially allowing him to reform an empire that would then later become the Flesh Eater Courts. So we've heard that during the Age of Myth there was this noble, just, feared but also loved vampire and vampire champion of Nagash named Usran. But during the Age of Myth, towards the end of the Age of Myth, there is no, the truth of it as to the reasons why this happened has been completely lost to the march of time. The only people who perhaps know the true reasons why this happened and why the sort of relationship between Nagash and Usran began to fall into that of complete animosity is probably known only to Usran himself and Nagash himself. And Usran's mind is probably so far gone that he can't even remember why he was attacked. Maybe he didn't even know why Nagash turned upon him. And Nagash, well, he's a king of the dead, the god of the dead, and he isn't going to be telling anyone anyway. He will not have to see why he has to justify his actions. And he may have even just forgotten. This may have been just some vampire that in his eyes simply just needed to be brought down a peg or two, and that was simply it. But during the Age of Myth, towards the end, the Carrion King, the Usran, he wasn't known as the Carrion King at this point, but Usran, this champion of Nagash, did fall completely out of favour with Nagash, and Nagash punished him by cursing him with a hideous transformation that turned him from a handsome, noble knight in appearance to a hideous, disfigured being that of course we now know as the aberrant vampire or the aberrant bloodline. As a result of this, following this dispute with Nagash and his hideous transformation, Usran was no longer welcomed as a benevolent saviour within the lands of Shyish. Instead, he was shunned and even hunted down by those empires for whom he had once done so much. Malformed and filled with anger against his former master, he became a monster like no other, and began to prowl the nightlands of Shyish. He continued to travel from land to land, but instead of granting boons to the great necromancer's loyal subjects, he offered them only a portion of his bitter malice. Such was the devastation spread by his fury that scores of Nagash's kingdoms were completely destroyed, their lords slain, and their peoples torn apart, and their cities reduced to naught but ruin and broken corpses. It was shortly after Usran's rampage through the realms of Shyish that of course he found himself reunited with his old court of knights and nobles. However, these knights and nobles, unlike the other servants of Nagash, had loyalty to Usran above all else. And despite his hideous transformation, despite his disfigured form, they saw him as they once did, as they have always done, as this noble knight and champion of the lands. Yes, they could see his disfigured form, but they could still see the knight within him. And so they chose to raise their banners and raise their swords in dedication to Usran, and they formed with him a court once more. The children of the night would ride once again, and they formed their armies, and with Ushuran's knowledge of the empire of Nagash, they waged a war against Nagash and his servants and won many, many battles. Such an insult, of course, could not be borne by Nagash, and so after losing many battles against Ushuran and his court and the armies that they had formed, he ordered his most powerful, the Mortarchs, the most loyal and powerful of his servants, to bring the wayward king to heel. The Mortarchs of Night, Sacrament and Blood gathered their unliving armies in a series of brutal wars that managed to eventually scatter the last of the king's forces. The one known as Ushuran was brought before Nagash, but rather than obliterating his soul for the sins that he had committed against the great necromancer, Nagash imprisoned his former servant in a prison called the Shroud Cage. This was a towering edifice of broken promises. Its walls reflected endless untruths upon the king, reducing him into a raving wreck, as twisted in the mind as he was now in body. So the king may have stayed there for all of eternity, had it not instead been for the god king Sigmar as he descended from Azir. In the first years of the Age of Chaos, Sigmar invaded the realm of death, incensed by Nagash's perceived betrayal at the all points. During Sigmar's rampage through the great necromancer's domains, his armies brought down the bastion that held the Shroud Cage, unwittingly allowing the thing that would become known as the Carrion King to scuttle forth from the ruin. What's interesting, of course, is that even though during the wars against Nagash, which of course Ushuran eventually lost against the Mortarchs, he had lost many of his first court, those warriors and nobles that were completely and utterly loyal to him. However, all of them were not killed. Few of them had survived and simply scattered across the land, and it was they who lured Sigmar into towards the stronghold where their liege was imprisoned, and it was they that were responsible for Sigmar destroying unwittingly the Shroud Cage that imprisoned their liege. Once this prison had been destroyed, they were reunited with the Carrion King as he had now become. Madness in mind and madness in body, which then would go and infect his old court. His court would become as deranged as he was, and they would then help propagate this madness across the land and allow him to develop his empire once more. However, infecting his old court with the insanity that now raged throughout his body was not enough for the new Carrion King, for the court was too small to reform an empire. Although those vampires that had remained loyal to him and had survived the wars would become the greatest of the aberrants within the realms that were created, the Carrion King needed to expand his court, and so began to summon and recruit new courtiers to his side once more, passing his insanity to them also, and in doing so forming the first court in his resurrected empire. Lord Marabroth took up his position of old as protector of the Carrion King, gathering elite mordants to his ragged banner to ensure no harm would again befall the sovereign. The swift and secretive Baron Gizzard commanded ghouls and great patrols around the borders of his lord's burgeoning lands, seeking out enemies who dared draw near and slaughtering any who let their guard down. These and others were the first of the Carrion King's cursed descendants, and they carved out a gruesome domain in Shias during the Age of Chaos, before spreading out into the realms that found new courts of their own. Of this initial generation of abhorrence, little else is known. Their histories lost beneath a veil of time and madness. It is said that some travel the realms as archregents, and that others fight beside the Carrion King to this day. However, the new empire that the Carrion King had now formed within Shias, and the courts that were affiliated with it, was not the only empire that was to form during this time, as many of the abhorrents that the Carrion King had formed began to spread throughout the lands via the realm gates to found kingdoms in far distant realms. Like all inhabitants of the mortal realms, during the Age of Chaos, these courts were set upon by the armies of the dark gods, but where most civilizations crumbled to dust under the relentless advance of chaos, the flesh eaters thrived. For every army of mordants that were hacked apart or set ablaze by the adulterous warriors, simply more were raised from the pitiful masses that had been left to wither and die in the ruins of once glorious cities. United by the madness of an abhorrent, these mordants then turned their hunger into a deadly weapon. During the Age of Chaos, however, when anarchy and ruination abounded, the few tales that were told of the Carrion King became lost and came to an abrupt end. Though the influence of his derangement persisted and continued to grow, his whereabouts became completely unknown. More mysterious still are his motives and his loyalties, for none can truly say whether the Carrion King continues to rage against Nagash for his disfigurement and his treatment, or if in his madness he believes himself to be in the great necromancer's good graces. Many of those courts descended from him fight alongside the undead armies of the Mortocks, yet simply many others attack the servants of Nagash on sight. Those whose cursed lineage is least removed from the Carrion King still live within the ruins of his ancient kingdom, deep within Shias. In them, the curse of the king is strongest, and their collective madness feeds off and permeates the land. The further from the ruinous empire the courts stray, however, the more their delusions diverge from that of the Carrion King, though the degree of their insanity remains undiminished. The full truth of Ushrun's tale has been forgotten by all but one, the great necromancer himself. Indeed, Nagash remembers well what transpired and still speaks of his former champion across the mortal realms. And that today, guys, is enough on the founder of the Flesh Eater Courts, the very first of the aberrant Ghoul Kings, the Carrion King himself, Ushrun the Handsome. I hope you enjoyed this story, and I hope it really gives you insight into the very origins of the Flesh Eater Courts. And of course, in further videos, we'll be looking at the hierarchy and formation of a court, the derangements that sort of exist within the courts, and of course, we'll be looking at the grand courts themselves, such as the Blister Skin Courts and the Gristlegore Courts, for example. So thank you, guys. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed today. If you did, like, give us a thumbs up and share the video. If not, doesn't matter. Don't worry. Not a problem. But please always feel free to comment in the comment section, whether it be good or bad. Thank you very much for listening, guys. I will see you soon with more tales about the Flesh Eater Courts. Goodbye.